Basically, my name is, that's the hard name actually. It's Andrzej Klimczuk. Klimczuk, the surname. It's not a Polish surname, to be honest. It's Ukrainian, but I'm Polish. I'm PhD in public policy studies, and I work on our SGH, that's the Warsaw School of Economics in Poland, in Warsaw. My first background is sociology, the second is economics, and the third one is public policy. But I focus mostly on a social gerontology and aging policy, to be exact, or the labor market, actually, which is a little bit different field of studies, labor policy. And for years I was publishing a lot of strange publications, actually, on the labor market, on older people aging, outplacement, creative industries, and recently that was the studies on social innovations for the older people. And at the moment I'm editing volume on a sharing economy, nothing to do with the older people at all, and another volume on a demographic analysis, which is nearly ready, and another volume on COVID-19, socioeconomic consequences of the COVID-19. What else are you doing? And another volume on a citizen science, actually, with some people that I get know actually in a cost action on citizen science with German colleagues, actually, at some point. That's probably the full answer.
How did you come to aging studies or social gerontology in a way? I mean, that's not a regular field, or at least I really don't know a lot of people that do it, so I'm always kind of interested, and that's more of a personal thing, just kind of interested how you came to be interested in later life, in older age and demographic change. Or
it's a nice question, actually, because to be honest, I'm not talking this story to everyone, so not everyone knows how I get into the field on studies on aging. It was probably like in 2005, 2006 when actually I was observing consequences of death of my grandfather. And it's not literally said in the book that was my grandfather, but that was the main reason when I noticed that it's something wrong with our society, to be honest, in Poland, but not only in Poland now, that is broader field, that, you don't notice sometimes the roles of older people until basically they gone. I didn't realize the role of the older persons unless the legal consequences of the death have been exposed. And most of the people, don't think about that, basically, because you don't think, that your family will die at some point, and that, probably, a lot of people don't have the land, for example, right? And you have the land, you have to share the space basically with someone, or there will be a spatial conflict. So that was the case that I was observing, actually. So, someone who was not that significant during life started to be really significant after death. That was unbelievable. And I realized that actually in a lot of cases, in a lot of other families, that there is a same case, that everything is happening fine until there is, for example, retirement of the family, and the retirement as additional income, can be shared. And when someone is dying, actually, there is the problems are getting starting, actually, or the problems are getting starting when the older persons are getting into dementia or palliative state, let's say. So the things are getting much more complex then. And the second reason, actually, when I started the studies was actually there was nearly no deep studies on aging in Poland. There was a very limited group of people doing that, and doing that for quite a while, because most of the studies in Poland started in 50s, 60s already in a previous century. But they have been oriented into, let's say, a futuristic, neurological direction, related to, let's say, forecasting, the demographic forecasting.
Yeah.
So that there was a rising awareness that in the future there will be old society, and we have to prepare ourselves to change this future. And And I was not in the world at all, of course, and unless a few decades later, you see the new publications with saying the same notion that we have to do something because they are coming, basically. The older people are coming.
The looming wave, the silver tsunami, and all of these things.
Something like that. So when I started the studies on aging, actually in Polish language, it was like a few years after the pensions reform. And it was like a gloomy vision that basically they will ruin the pension system, the healthcare system, etc. So we have to do something about that. And that's it, so, but basically we have done nothing, to be honest, that much. And, rising awareness was one of the things. And the second was actually, that was like a demographic apocalypse, let's say, in literature. And I was, to be honest, shocked when because I have this death of my grandfather. I started thinking about the topic for my master degree, and I was like, oh my God, like why they are saying that the apocalypse is coming, basically, and you have to do something about that. So let's go into the topic. And I started studying on futuristic studies, like future studies or futurology. And it's unbelievable that it's happening again. It was already said in the past, and now we are saying same, but maybe in a different way. So when I started doing that, actually, the notion of the active aging, etc., started being promoted. Actually, we also have the promotion of the aging policy started in Poland a little bit. So it's funny because when I started master degree, there was no strategic documents, for example, on aging in Poland, or the topic was really well hidden in different fields like the social problems, let's say, or the pensions policy, but it was not literally integrated in some clever way. And when I was changing the master study into the book, actually, it started appearing to have some like a strategic and let's say planistic programmatic way how to respond to the crisis, let's say, of demographic aging, with changing also the meanings, that we have to think, let's say, I don't like this word, but like a positive way on aging, or much more positive. And I got, I was at that moment, I didn't even know about those theories, to be honest. I have no idea about that because a lot of those things have not been translated to Polish. I was not reading at that point that much on aging in English. As a starting with these studies, and I signed up to the strange master class to Professor Andrzej Sadowski in my city of Białystok, and he had the master class on social capital. So for me, there was a very easy, connotation, like just simply combine social capital and older people. And see what happens, and actually it happened a lot because nobody have done that before anywhere. And actually after some digging, there was only 2 publications at that time when I was starting that, one in Polish, one in English, saying something that there is a social capital of older people somehow existing somewhere, but we have to somehow measure it or provoke people to start using that. So that was, on the one hand, now I can say from much more critical, let's say, perspective, that at that time, I was maybe thinking in a quite liberal or neoliberal way, that the older people could be, classified as a human capital, etc., or the social capital. But later on, I started actually studying with the social capital idea of Bourdieu, that actually it's not that simple actually to have only this perspective, because you also can have the critical perspective on social economy, or why the people actually have it or use it or not.
But that kind of brings me to this idea, because I have been sort of working on class myself, just really short chapter. But what I've noticed is that a lot of people just kind of go with the, class isn't really a tool for analyzing later life, or for sort of as a tool that we can use in order to analyze it, because it has been sort of superseded by consumption, by taste, by this sort of individual capitalism, that we shouldn't really use class any longer. And if you look at gerontological literature, which is really interesting, that you rarely find class as a category. For instance, in all of those handbooks, you find a lot of things on gender, on ethnicity, but you rarely find anything on class, which sort of perpetuates this idea that class isn't really important. And I mean, you've worked on class. Why do you think should we still talk about class, and where do you think are the important points that we should consider when we talk about later life and class?
Of course, like to be much more correct, I'm not, in my opinion, I'm not the specialist on class studies, to be honest. In my case, actually, it was very simple, actually, to combine the concept from Bourdieu mostly into studies on older people and aging, like how basically you can analyze aging or life course or life cycle, because I see the difference between that, but as you see in the literature, most of the people see the life course perspective, which I don't like, to be honest, that much, because in Polish language, maybe a life cycle is much more precise, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And also from the political studies, life cycle is much more actually, I know it's old school theory a little bit for a lot of people, but life cycle is much more political perspective, because you are not talking about the perspective of one or two generations, but you are talking about the perspective of generations to come as well. And probably they will be repeating the same, problems and challenges again and again and again in this like a vicious cycle until they will resolve some of the issues, right? So some of the problems are repeating. So that's also very clear in Bourdieu, I suppose, that it's unfortunately, now I can say it's very depressive theory what Pierre Bourdieu proposed, because it's very deterministic. You cannot simply get out from social class, right? You are printed into the class, or somehow combined or bounded actually. So you cannot simply get out. You have to be, I don't know, super extra, individualistic to get out of it, and find somehow the way, to manage with the advancement in the fields that you are moving in, which is not easy. Of course, the biography of Bourdieu itself is a nice example how you can get out from the early class that you are in, but you will never get out probably because of the connections that you have, or the capital that you have, the cultural capital. So I'm completely aware of it. And in my biography as well, I'm not from the like a higher class. I don't have the blue blood, for example, or something like that. So I managed somehow to get the PhD at the end, but it was like a struggle. It was complete struggle, to be honest. Maybe because I don't have the social capital or something like that.
I think it's mostly the cultural capital that sort of, I mean, I'm from a working class family, and it was really hard because people just kind of knew some things, like how to behave, how to talk. They knew certain, I mean, art forms or certain books that they had read when they were teenagers. And I just kind of was thrown in there and was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but
actually I know what are you talking about, because I have the same experience in my life, that I'm not, with the connection with the higher classes that much. And that's give me another way of thinking again, why this, inequality is really important. For example, one of the studies that I was doing was a very simple comparison between the older people living in nursing homes and older people attending the universities of tiered age in Poland. And there was a clear class distance, let's say, like the people, in nursing home, you cannot get there basically by coincidence. You have to be from poor family, or you don't have the money to have your own housing any longer because someone died, for example, or your family don't want to pay another part of money to give you the individual housing, so you cannot be independent. You end up in a nursing home with plenty of other people, like with alcoholic problems as well. And if you have not been in such an environment before, that's unbelievable, right? Because
Mhm.
you are going down basically on a ladder, let's say. And on a second hand, you have these people in a university of third age. Most of them, in this case of my studies, it was like most of them have like very long family traditions from the higher class, very rich families, or like artistic families. Or the families with the factories, etc. So they have been rich people mostly, either by the financial resources, either the traditions at least, and with this like a sense that they are better than the others, basically, because that was the common thing, that they think that they are better than the other older people around them, so they are not in common. For example, when I asked the questions, are you involved into any voluntaristic activities like helping neighbors, or helping in healthcare environments or nursing homes, the answer was like, I will never go there. Those people are, like lazy. They are not, you should not help them, basically. So that was the very, clear features of the Bourdieu theory are still working basically in our societies, right? Like they can tell you in your face that not everyone is equal in this world, and we don't want to have anything in common with those people. I went further with this concept that basically to opposite like this direction, like that we can change that we can use like the notion, like, yeah, probably at some point I'm even citing like in a Joseph Bios, that everyone can be artist, or everyone is creative in some way, or could be creative. So it's completely utopistic, of course, like let's be honest, it's utopistic. And by coincidence, only by coincidence, when I was doing studies on something completely else, on a silver economy, I noticed the concept of creative aging. And I was shocked because the concept was mostly in US, and there was nearly nothing about that in Europe. At the time when I was starting doing studies on creative aging, there was nearly nothing in Europe, neither in UK or Ireland. I was like, what is happening? Like, why they are doing this creative aging in US? That doesn't make any sense. And by coincidence, someone from Palgrave Macmillan contacted me and asked, can you extend this and write the whole book about that? And I was like,
I can write too.
No, my answer was really unpolite, I suppose. Like the answer was like, oh my God, seriously? Like why do you want me to ask the whole book? And later on I realized that that's maybe like a lottery winning, actually. Let's do the whole book proposal. By coincidence it was accepted, and I was like, oh my God, now I have the big trouble, because now I have to write the book. Writing the books is different than writing the papers, because when you're writing paper, you are focusing on writing 15 to 20 pages to be cohesive in the short form. But when you are writing the book, you have to focus on something bigger, actually. You have to dig around, not like 20 other pages, 20 other papers, but 2,000 other papers or books to get around and go really deep into the topic. And after this, two-volume experience, I got the idea that basically if you want to create something really new and some really interesting idea or interesting theory, you cannot close that in 20 pages paper. It's never.
Sometimes you need a bit more space.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, for example, of course, in Bourdieu, initial idea about the forms of capital was like one paper, 20 pages or something about the forms of capital. It's a classic now. But the full idea actually was in a book on the reproduction, social reproduction, and the book on distinction, right? Which is
true.
huge, actually. I don't know what is the German version, but the Polish one is very big. So, but gives you the explanation that it's not the easy idea at the end. It's only easy at the beginning, but when you go into details, it could be really much more complex, and you can continue that forever probably as well. So the same was in case of my book. The point was to integrate all those strange creative ideas that floating somewhere around the older people into one one theory or one political idea in one place. And that was really hard.
Could you summarize what creative aging is for you? And how that relates to class or to capital?
Oh my God! I'm I will simply read the definition from the book. That will be easier. I was thinking about that so long that I don't want to change
mess it up.
To mess it up.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the second volume of the book, and I will read it loud. So the creative aging is a process of engaging people in creative activity as they age. It aims to depart from highlighting problems of older adults to instead indicating their creative capital. It connects art with lifelong learning, community integration and rehabilitation, and therapeutic activities to improve physical and psychosocial conditions, build awareness and promote the experience of older people, and then transfer it to the younger and future generations. That's really abstract, right? At some point. So I was trying to make this book not European-centered as much as possible. And actually discussions with my proofreader, let's say, from India was actually very, very constructive in the way to create very different meaning, like to get international consensus, let's say, on some stuff. So maybe some ideas in these books sounds quite abstract, actually, because of that discussions. I definitely underline that the creative aging is, on one hand, policy idea different than healthy aging, successful aging, active aging, productive aging, aging in place, intergenerational policy, or anything you can imagine right now, because there is few other issues like that. But on a second hand, creative aging is like subordinate, let's say, concept to the active aging, because it's not that different, but it's like filling the space that is missing in active aging, because active aging was completely omitting the idea of culture, and the healthy aging, of course, is about health. Productive aging is much more about the labor market, for example, or the work or the voluntary stuff. So basically, I was trying to dig around why the creative aging was so popular in the literature, mostly in US. And it was funny actually to notice that in Europe, it was not defined that way until recently, actually.
That's interesting. I mean, especially when it comes to social gerontology, a lot of people are just talking about, that older adults need to be engaged with society. They need to be productive, taking jobs and all of these things. But there is actually really few notions that go into you can be productive, but in a creative way, not so much that you produce something that you can sell or that it's economically worthwhile, but something that is just different. So that's actually quite nice to have a sort of a third space where that can be explored, that is not regulated by market or economic interests or anything.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Health.
That's good that you pointed out that, because I was trying to explain that actually in a first volume, that and it's directly related actually to the theory of Bourdieu, that basically, because a lot of people have the problem with understanding the differences of the types of capital.
Could you explain them briefly and why they are problems?
When you have, for example, the human capital, so it could be understood like the skills and Yeah, the skills of the people, basically, what you can do, basically, or your knowledge in your head, in your brain, basically. So the knowledge plus skills. Then you have social capital. That means the networks and social relations with other people, who you know, how you can use the connections to other people, right? Then you have the cultural capital, and at this point, the things are getting complicated usually, because most of the people don't see the difference between the cultural capital and human capital.
Yeah.
Because one of the forms of the cultural capital could be the embedded capital, which is inside of the people, and it's again skills and knowledge. But of course, the cultural capital is much more complex, because it's also all the values, norms, and symbols that could be used to interpret the things or to name them. So, for example, traditions or the religious behaviors that the people have. That's the cultural quantities, right? And in Bourdieu studies, it's very clear that the cultural capital is much more broader than social, and definitely he is not using the human capital notion, but it was created at the same time, mostly in Coleman studies in economics. And when you have these two notions, the social and cultural, and at some point, of course, Bourdieu is saying that there is a third type of capital, or the fourth one, the symbolic capital, which is like the highest level, because it's something like the cultural capital plus the power. So you can like use the symbols to manipulate the people, basically, to force the power, or to use the the political agenda that you have. And it's getting even weirder at this point, right? Because it means that basically the culture that you are creating, the cultural objects, art, or the literature, or the cultural behavior that the people have, can be used to manipulate other people, basically, to force them into the direction that you want to have.
Yeah.
So the higher classes are doing that exactly. They are creating the behaviors that, or the distinctions that could be distinct them from the lower classes or the middle class, right? And at this point, it's getting even much more complex, because at some point there was a very influential book of Richard Florida on creative class. So he explained something that, of course, he was criticized for, that his story could be written, read in a completely opposite way. That means that, of course, you have the social capital, human capital, and the creative capital. Creative capital is like a different form of cultural capital, because it underlines that everyone could be creative, especially the art is like the example of being creative, right? And Florida says that, of course, there are some people that could be much more creative than the other people, and they are in a higher class, but we have to find them, and they are very well hidden usually, and he's using the indicators for that, like the Bohemian indicators, or the gay index, so-called. So we will find the gays, where the gays are located, in which companies or which places in administration. That's probably the most creative places in the world. Of course, the critics of Florida said that, oh my God, why the gay index? Like, why that, for example, right? That was one of the most probably criticized element. The second element was, wait a second, like those people actually are concentrated in the places which are the wealthiest places in the world, like the Silicon Valley, right? So they are not only creative, but they are also wealth. So basically, why the other creative people are not well paid as well, right? So of course, the Florida later explained that that was his mistake, because basically the creative capital could be read in a different way. Like actually, it leads to the inequalities. Basically, that the places with the highest creative capital levels are actually the places with the biggest inequalities as well. So you have these like creative minds, and at the same time on the streets you have a lot of homeless people, like in San Francisco, right? Of course, in the case of the older people, it's quite easy to understand that, actually, I think, because most of the people in our societies think that the older people are unproductive and they have to stay like that. When you get the retirement, you should basically do nothing or just do some fun. And the fun is not productive usually because it's mostly a consumption. And on a second hand, there are some countries where you don't have the retirement and the people are still productive and active in their 60s, 70s, right? Like, for example, South Korea or Japan, and the people are working basically to the death if they like to work. And nobody is forcing you to work that much. It's the cultural thing, the cultural difference. So in the concept that I have in the book, it says basically that everyone can be creative, basically that everyone can be used as a creative resource, let's say. I know that it sounds a little bit neoliberalistic, but basically that's the point. Like, if we realize that in some countries the people are living on a retirement for like 1/3 of their life, like for 30 years, and they are for example, in Poland, the older people are the biggest consumers of television, so probably in Germany is the same. Yeah. So basically, it's really depressive because you have to realize that it's a lot of waste time of the life that could be invested into something much more, let's say, interesting than watching I don't know, the stars on TV, etc. Because maybe, you can do something much more productive. The point is that it's welcomed that you will leave something after you. So, of course, there is second interpretation also hidden in my books, both of them, because it's written in a quite positive way that we have to invest in a creative activities of older people, that the older people can be creative, etc. And that will be good also for the public policy or the social policy, if you like, because the people will be active and creative. And in the end, it will have the positive effect on the longevity and on a quality of life and on a health quality. There was last year or 2 years ago a study from World Health Organization saying about the arts and health that there is a clear evidence that having the contact with art and cultural activities is improving the health. But there is also the brutalist, let's say, part of it, that from the state perspective, it leads you to cost cutting, basically, in healthcare, right? So if the people are active and creative, they don't have to spend the time with the bad conditions of health because they are still moving and still doing something, so they are not getting sick. So basically there is a hidden agenda in that the people will have the better quality of life, and the cost of older societies will be lower at the end. But of course, there is another, like a layer of it, that you can understand the creative aging actually as a do-it-yourself policies. You have to be creative to survive basically the retirement by yourself, because maybe the state will never help you actually, as if you don't have the retirement or your pension is so low that you basically cannot afford to have any healthcare. Then you create some strange communities actually to survive, right? So the creative aging is one of these answers, I suppose, and that's the brutal part actually.
It's interesting that, because it's creative aging that sort of presupposes artistic communities, and that would tie in with social capital, because people have been sort of going on about that. The more connections you have, the more family members, the more friends and so on, the more social capital you are able to amass, the better you feel and the better it is for your psychological and physical well-being. So that kind of ties creative aging together with this sort of idea of social capital, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the point. That in the pandemic, this wealth of social ties and social networks actually started being even much more important, right?
Yeah.
Because especially a year ago, in the first weeks of pandemics, there was, I don't know how it was in Germany, but probably similar, the neighborhood network started being important to bring the basic goods to houses of older people, right? So that the people have to help each other basically, otherwise they will not get out from home to get to grocery shop, etc. And they started organizing themselves from the beginning. A year later, we can say that some of these activities still are ongoing, and most of them basically disappeared because now we are getting into, I suppose, that's my hypothesis, into much more egoistic state, to be honest. When I was writing the book, it was clearly focused on the stronger networks you have, it will be better for your retirement. And now you see that if someone doesn't have the networks at all, it end up in a hospital basically. After the pandemic, can we actually still saying that there is some notion of the intergenerational solidarity in Europe actually? When you go through the mass media, there is already so many people pissed off because of the queue to the vaccination that the older people are getting first.
Yeah.
Not the young, right? So because not the young productive, but the older unproductive people. So even in the discussion about the vaccination, these inequalities have been exposed again.
Yeah, I think that there has also been a couple of conferences that I know in aging studies that deal with the idea of sort of COVID exposing most, or not exposing, but highlighting most of the problems that are with old age, especially with these ideas with sort of why are the old vaccinated first? Shouldn't we wait for that? And so on and so forth. There are also, I think it was last summer, there were also reports of people just going like, why don't you let them die? Then we can solve two problems, right? We have more vaccinations for younger people and we deal with the entire demographic change. And that is really weird. It just having that thought and thinking about it seriously in a public domain is really, really weird and really terrifying, to be fair. So
yeah, it is actually. I also remember that during the last summer, probably this kind of no, not the last summer, actually a year ago when the pandemic started, this kind of discussion was really loud, I suppose, in UK. When some of the epidemiologists have been literally saying actually that you have to get this community immunity to the coronavirus.
Yeah, exactly.
By deaths of the people. It's unbelievable, 21st century. And some people are saying, let them die. I was like, wow.
Exactly. It's this integration thing. I mean, that older people just kind of disengage with society and that society disengages with them, because that was regarded as so normal for the longest time. And now there are sort of other policies that say, no, we need to sort of not separate them, but kind of bring them back together. And then suddenly you have this pandemic and everyone goes like, you know what, why not let them die? And it's really, really frustrating.
Yeah, it's really shocking.
So where do you think, just to get back to class even, I mean, because you have obviously worked on it, where do you think does class impact older adults the most?
I also mentioned to you with this difference with the life course and life cycle, because mostly in the literature, the people are using the notion of life course. But in my perspective, I think that the life cycle is a longer, existing concept actually in the literature. And you also have this in the first volume of the book explained, is much more correct, because you look at the things from the longer term, from the longer perspective, and you see that the history is repeating basically. And that's also very classic, let's say, view, because if you see class, the class is reproducing, right? So it's not happening in one generation, but it's happening during few generations. So also in Bourdieu, he's literally saying that basically the mobility is so important for the people, the space mobility, because sometimes you have to move somewhere basically to change your life, right? So, for example, I know that in Germany, for example, in some occupations, you have to go around the country because you cannot change the next stage on your career cannot be continued in the same place, right? Especially in the public sector. But it's not everywhere in the world that you have to move, and the people are not mobilized to get out of the place where they live. So basically, in some places, the people are bounded basically by the geographic, let's say, terms, bounded to the place where they have been born, where they live, and they will probably die there in some way, right? So if you are bounded in the place, it means that basically you are bounded also to the class where you live. And of course, the environment, in meaning the economic environment, can change and may force you to leave the place. And maybe it will be your advancement or even worse. So, for example, like let's get the example of the Central Eastern countries where I live. A lot of people from rural areas or the small cities basically have to move to the bigger cities in the West, because in their cities there was no work, right? So they cannot advance in a class or even stay in the same class without moving anywhere, because they can only go lower actually into the level of poverty. So in order to survive, basically they have been, for example, migrating to UK or US or to Belgium, Germany, etc., right? And that's an ongoing process. One of the studies that I was doing later, but I didn't publish it because of various reasons. I didn't have the time and possibility to do that. One of the studies was about the inequality of innovations for the older people in Europe. And the funny thing is that most of the innovations are in the same places where the other innovations, technological mostly, are produced. So basically there is like this notion of the blue banana of Europe. Yeah, it's called like that. And basically out of it, there is nearly nothing. Like there is no development, economical development on the same level. So the rest of the regions basically are only reproducing or diffusing the things from the center. So in this sense, the theories of center periphery make a lot of sense also for the class. But basically it makes sense, so it's basically also for the older people, because I don't know, do you have this notion in German language? In Polish language, we have the notion starych drzew się nie przesadza, which means like the older trees are not something that you can move, basically. So
we have the same thing.
Yeah, so the older people are the immobile group of people, right? So basically they have to stay where they've been born, and that's it. So that's the depressive part, actually.
It's just really strange. Every time you talk about old age, you just kind of get to this point where you go, that's actually really depressing.
I'm trying to be positive,
exactly.
To be positive, because I know continue the positive part,
It's a really good way. I think it's much more approachable and accessible to many people, especially because one of the criticisms of especially third age and sort of active aging has been that you kind of disregard those people that are, and I think it's a quote, too poor or too disabled to actually engage in it. And I think this is something that creative aging really nicely bridges in a way.
Yeah, you can, but you don't have to, because like get this, comparison to the positive aging, which is not used that often because of the active aging, or the active and healthy aging is the common frame.
Yeah.
The positive aging is another part of story, because I also try to explain that in the book, that it's not used so often, and that's the one thing. And the second thing is nearly only used in a very Anglo-Saxon countries, very neoliberal approach to aging, that you have to be positive in a sense, like positive psychology, let's say.
Yeah.
That you have to be smiling in front of the problems and consume and produce as much as possible.
Think positive.
And think positive that your retirement will not be that bad,
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you will not die basically during the retirement, like it's so absurd actually. So the positive aging, I suppose that it's like the extreme example, how the good things, good idea can go really wrong. The same was of course, historically speaking, let's say the same was with the successful aging and productive aging, because very quickly the people return these notions into unproductive aging and unsuccessful aging, right? So
exactly, it always implies something else. Positive aging implies negative aging, and unsuccessful and unhealthy aging.
And probably because of it, that the World Health Organization changed the paradigm a little bit, or the discourse, to be much more precise, because they stopped using the active aging, I suppose, in 2015 that much, and they started promoting healthy aging. Again, it's mostly soft measures and soft instruments, tools to promote beautiful retirement, let's say, vision with the healthy lifestyle. But basically, exactly, lifestyle actually, because we didn't use the notion of lifestyle at any point, but that's the lifestyle is also one of these distinctive features between the classes, that you also have the lifestyle of the, for example, artist, or the lifestyle of working class, right? So that's the distinction as well. They notice that actually the active aging is too broad basically, because they have to focus on a health, not on a active, because they are World Health Organization basically. And in the report, it's from 2015, it's very clearly said that we are stopping with the active aging. It was successful already as a concept, but let's focus on a narrow perspective, and let's focus on how to make the people health better basically. And it's much more, I think, to be honest, it's much more instrumental. By the way, we didn't even touch the topic. Like, there is a lot of discussions during the last couple of years. When I was starting the book, there was nearly no discussions about that in this sense, how to combine questions on automation and artificial intelligence with older people or the aging. And now, it's actually practice problem already, that basically the automation started in so many industries that there will be no, workers in some spaces, and definitely not the older workers and physical workers at all. So basically, when I was starting writing about that, I suppose in 2012 or 13, there was nobody even care about the fact that, the future society with the automation, like in Japan actually, is not the society with the older people in today meanings, because there will be a lot of more older people, but probably the rest of the workforce will be automated, right? So we have to get this notion around and get the idea that basically the artificial intelligence also related to ageism is already happening. It's not something that will happen. It's already ongoing, actually. Nobody knows what will happen later, that basically the apps that the people are using, or not even using, actually, they don't have to use it, actually, because it's enough when you are calling to the bank as an older person. You in some cases you will never even talk with the human person, right?
So you'll just click yourself through numbers and have some automated voicemail kind of thing.
But that's the future that we have. I think that it's accelerating quite well. When I was doing the second volume, I had to at some point add the one-page comment on smart cities and Internet of Things and smart silver economy, how that develops actually, because it started being realistic that definitely most of the innovative solutions for the older people are around the smart solutions, and it's happening right now. So I think that's the future actually, like the people with the access to the automation and the people without the automation. Okay.
So I don't have any questions any longer.
Thank you.
It was really, really nice talking to you.
Okay, so
okay, all right then.
have a good evening. Rest
You
of
too.
the good evening.